Good morning. Welcome back. It is Monday. I don't know what day of the month it is. Kind of lost track of that. I saw something funny posted on the internet. There's only 3 days now: today, yesterday, and tomorrow. So, welcome to today, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hope you had a good yesterday. Today we are going to continue doing our discussion of Unit 3. Keep in mind this unit, the way we're going to do it from now going forward is I'm going to post a video every Monday, every Wednesday, and every Friday. Except for this week, no posts on Friday because Friday is the start of spring break. So I'm not going to post anything. You can enjoy that freedom. I think it's like 10 days or so that you have off. If you want to travel, you can travel. I've heard nice things about backyards. I've heard nice things about living rooms. Some people have even ventured into basements or attics if you have those. I don't. I live in an apartment. So those 10 days I'm not going to post anything or really expect you to do much. If you want to do work on the stuff that you can, by all means do. But we won't be posting a video on Friday. But yeah, so we're going to continue our talk about economic globalization, keeping in mind the question, does globalization contribute to sustainable prosperity for all people? So on Friday we introduced a lot of concepts. Hopefully you had a chance to watch the video. Strongly encourage you to. It'll really be beneficial for you to know the content in that video before you watch this one. So if you're following along in your booklet, this is page 13. It's number student activity 22. We're going to talk about the political and economic challenges and opportunities of globalization. So like anything that we've been talking about, I will always bring you both sides of the argument. You will just find where you feel your opinion or your beliefs or your thoughts rest. So we're going to talk about the positives and the negatives. So let's just start. So we're going to start with the question of what political and economic challenges and opportunities are associated with globalization. The increasing globalized world and the speed of communication means concerns in other countries are affecting us more and more. So we talked about last Friday the internet and the connectedness of the world via the internet. So this telecommunications network that is spread around the world. It causes us to feel the effects of other countries. I think this year so far is an example of how in one country the effects have spread around the world. So we had a virus outbreak in Wuhan, China, that is now spread all over the world, and it just shows the connectedness of us as humans. There is concerns about the economy as well. The economy of the United States and the stock market there is being watched by people all over the world. So we are very much interconnected by this telecommunications web. So it does make us a little bit more vulnerable when people in other countries or countries start to have problems. So increasingly, governments are taking a hands-off approach to economic management. So we're going to see what this means by hands-off approach. So really, the governments are trying to be less involved and trying to let the economy kind of run its course and do its own thing. So we'll see what that means in the few slides to come up, but I have to introduce you to a few more key concepts before we can really get a good understanding going in this understanding of economic, the challenges and opportunities, and this hands-off approach. So, economic growth and sustainable prosperity. So economic competition is increasing within the globalized world. So we are seeing countries now start to get a better sense of their economic power. So when we talked about colonialism and imperialism last unit, we saw how Europeans colonized the world and they kind of brought all of the resources from these colonies back into Europe to kind of strengthen their own economies, their industries, and things like that. When we start to see the independence movements of these countries, places like the United States, Canada, India, Brazil, we start to see them at the beginning, they're very slow going in their economy because they're trying to catch up. But now that they've had years to catch up, you're seeing places like Brazil, places like India and China, their economies are starting to strengthen very, very rapidly, and it's a sustained um, growth. So what that means is that it's not like they're going through a really high growth and then they crash. No, even if it's a slow progression for upwards, it means that there is more competition for economic growth. So we measure the economic growth through a country's gross domestic product, so the GDP, and it increases year to year. So whenever you see GDP, that's the total value of goods produced and services provided in a country during 1 year. So that's how that's how the global community kind of understands or puts a value on success of a country. So if a country has a really high GDP, they're seen as a really prosperous and successful country. That, like I said, that's the general understanding of how a country is kind of graded almost. It is interesting though. There is one country in Southeast Asia, Bhutan. If you don't know what it is, look it up. It's a little small country. They actually measure the success of their country not based on GDP but on happiness. So they actually have a Ministry of Happiness in their government. They just make sure they maintain a level of happiness within a country. It's really fascinating. I'll try to find the link because I had it before, but I seem to have misplaced it. Maybe it was in one of my other pants. So I will try to find that video and share it with you in the comments because it was really fascinating. I thought that was an interesting perspective on understanding success. So yes, GDP, the total value of goods produced and services provided in one country. We use that to track economic growth. If your GDP is going up every year, that means your economic growth is growing up every year, and that means you have a sustainable prosperity because it's not dropping. So if you're following along slide 6, this is a chart of Australia, Canada, Japan, the United States, the European Union, and Brazil. So you see that every country, they're slowly progressing up, but then there is a dip. 2009, you see a dip, and I want you to pay attention to that because that's every single country. Every single country had that dip. So Brazil, Canada, Japan, the European Union, Australia looked like it had a small blip, and the United States. So what that tells you is that when we were talking about how we feel the impact of other countries, you can see that in this chart right here, that in 2009 something happened and everything just dropped. And it dropped for everyone. So it does show you that countries are interconnected. So that is economic growth. We understand economic growth through a country's GDP. And the GDP of every country is sort of interconnected with others because, like we saw, in 2009, something happened and everyone's dropped just a little bit. Some more than others, because we have to remember that, yes, we're all connected, but some countries are a little bit more interconnected than others, and some have a lot more influence than others as well. So places like big economies like the United States, if all of a sudden their economy crashes, the entire world will feel it. But if a smaller country, if their economy starts to drop, it may not be as impacted. It might not impact the entire global community because of the size of economies. So just keep that in mind as well. So when we talked about the hands-off approach really can be defined by privatization. So governments, like we said, they may start to feel that they have to use this more hands-off approach. So they may decide to increase economic growth through privatization. So that GDP, they're thinking, will privatize to help it grow. So privatization is when a publicly run company or business is sold to a private sector. So there are some industries in countries that are run by the government. But there is, we talked about this increasing trend that the government is viewed as a poor business operator. So that's when they start to let things go. So there are some industries in countries that are run by governments. In Canada, we call them crown corporations. So things like Canada Post is a crown corporation. So it's run by the government. So here's three Canadian examples of stores or industries that were at one time run by the government, but then they slowly were sold into the hands of the private sector. So in 1993, the Alberta government privatized liquor stores. So liquor stores before were run by the government. So I think in Ontario they are still run by the government, but now they are owned and operated by different companies. So that's why you can go to you wouldn't go to them. You can see the different stores that operate them. Air Canada was privatized in 1998 by the federal government. So again, before 1988, that means that Air Canada was owned and operated by the federal government. And then Petro-Canada was privatized in 1990 by the federal government as well. So that means, again, before 1990, Petro-Canada used to be owned and operated by the Canadian government. It was sold, and now it's in the hands of private individuals. So that's privatization. So one side says the positives is that individuals now own it, so there is more economic growth. They can do things that the government couldn't do. They can put more money into it to try to expand the business, expand the brand, do things that governments couldn't really do. On the other side, they're often criticized because it's more based on profit now. If the Canadian government, let's use the example of Air Canada. The federal government, they're not necessarily in it for the profits. They're in it to keep this service for all Canadians, and it has to at least meet a certain line to keep it sustainable, so they're not losing money on it. Now that it's in the hands of private individuals, let's say myself, I bought Air Canada. I bought it from the Canadian government. My idea now is I need to make money off of what I've bought. So if the Canadian government had a baseline here and this was how much it cost to run the airline, that space in between my fingers, that would have been their profit. And it may be very small, and the Canadian government may have been okay with that. But now if this is how much it costs, and this is what the Canadian government was charging, I may want to do this. So I'm going to raise the prices of things like ticket prices. I may lower the wages of workers. I may make things that were one time free. I may make them have to pay for these sort of things. Because now you see the space in between my fingers. That's the profit that I'm going to make as an individual. So when we talk about privatization, there is that fear that people will raise prices just to make a profit off of them. There is another fear, this idea of monopolization. Monopolies are essentially if one group or one company owns everything in that sort of area. So a famous example was Microsoft. Microsoft at one time almost had a monopoly on the computer industry. But then it was brought to the Supreme Court of the United States, where they told them they had to break up the company. So we have to remember that if one company owns everything, then they can do and charge whatever they want. So let's use my Air Canada example, and I'm the owner of Air Canada. And let's say I'm the only airline company in Canada. There is no WestJet. If you want to fly out of Canada, you need to use Air Canada, or in between provinces and cities. What I can do as the only person who you can buy stuff from, I can charge whatever I want, because I know that there is nobody who you can go to, like say a competitor, and you can go and buy something from them, like an airline ticket. That's the fear of a monopoly. So that's the fear of privatization. But a lot of countries have done a really good job of making sure that that doesn't happen. Okay, so now we're going to switch over to this idea of knowledge economy. So one way to encourage economic growth is through the investment in knowledge economies. So these include businesses who are research, education, development, ideas, and collect information. So on this idea of economic growth, investing in businesses that are focused on changing things and doing research and education to new fields opens up an opportunity for economic growth. So it tends to be environmentally friendly because they're looking towards the future. They're looking of changing the ways that we do things now. So, for example, things like electric cars. They are seen as a more environmentally friendly way of doing things, as opposed to, say, the gasoline or the oil, gas powered cars, not oil. They occur in developed countries because they need that base to have that room to start to look for things, and they also need an advanced education base as well. So a country that's developed, they already have a baseline of like a really strong GDP, so they can expand and look into other ideas. They're not concerned about making sure that this level stays here because it's very strong, so that people don't have to be focused on making things. They can go to school and get educated. They can be entrepreneurs and try to figure out something new. So it does require that sort of space as well. So globalization allows new ideas to spread faster than ever before, because a person can, create an idea and then post it onto the internet, and then the entire world can see it. So knowledge economies are really important because they change the way that we do things now. So an example is, let's say you watching this video right now. I don't know who you are. Well, I don't know your name. Let me start that again. You right now watching this video, people will ask you, what do you want to do with your life? What do you want to do for a job? You may not have any idea. You may have an idea. Here's the interesting thing though. When you guys are finished high school, you say you go to post-secondary, whatever you want to do, there will be jobs that don't exist right now. These jobs that don't exist right now that you may do the rest of your life are because of knowledge economies. They are expanding the way that we do things, and we're doing them differently. So they're going to need people in these new industries, in these new fields that don't exist right now. So new technologies like robotics or artificial intelligence are relatively new technologies that decrease cost and remove human involvement from danger or repetitive tasks. So, like we said, we are evolving our economies to be a little bit more geared towards technology. If for those of you that are really tech savvy, that's fantastic, because the future will very much be based on technology, and what we're doing right now and what you're hearing right now will be super up to date, and like it sounds almost crazy to think about. But if you think in 50 years from now, you're gonna look back at this moment, and the stuff that we were doing that's like cutting edge, it'll be outdated. It's just like whenever if we go 100 years ago, um, things like planes were so cutting edge and the at the forefront of technology. Now they're just something that you can take to go on a trip. So there is a concern about the knowledge economy in relation to robotics and artificial intelligence, and it is on slide 11. The removal of humans. People do feel, and there is this is where there's a little bit of conflict in that people are afraid that if you replace humans, like self checkout machines, bank machines. You remove humans from these jobs, which impacts their ability to provide for their families. It impacts the economy. So there is a little bit of pushback there. So just keep that in mind as well. There is also the fear of a robotic takeover. So slide 12, if you're curious, this is the trailer for Terminator. If you have never seen the movie, you should watch it. It's really fun. It's really cool. Here is an excellent comparison chart of 1984 versus today. On slide 13, you can see the growth of technology. And I think the better graphic is on slide 14. Computers in 1984 compared to today. So on the left side, you have a 1984 Compaq Desk Pro 286. And it has all of the breakdowns. So the processor is 16 bytes, 7.14 megahertz clock speed. Memory is 128K of RAM. Storage is 20 to 70 megabytes. Monitor is a 12-inch display, and it would have cost around $5,000. Fast forward to modern times. This is a iPhone X. iPhone 10. This has a 64 bit 2.49 megahertz clock speed, so way faster. Memory is 4 gigabytes, way more memory. Storage is 64 to 512 gigabytes. That is that's huge. That's a huge gap. The monitor is 6.5 inch HD display, so it has a better display, and it costs $1,500. So you can see the cell phone that you have in your hands, it had more power than a computer did. If you are really curious, I would encourage you to Google this too. So in my hands right here, I have a USB. This USB has 32 gigabytes of space, and it's relatively small, as you can see. Go on Google and search 32 gigabytes memory storage, 1980 or 1990, or even, and you'll see that the size is massively, the space was huge, like to store the same amount of memory. So again, slide 15, if you're curious, the latest of the Terminator movies. Just you'll see in terms of movie production how it's changed, but very nice to look at. A nice little break. Okay, so let's move on to the idea of trade liberalization. So another way to encourage economic growth is through trade liberalization. So we've talked about knowledge economies. We have talked about the hands-off approach and privatization. These are ways that we can have economic growth. So trade liberalization is another. So trade liberalization, or free trade, is trade between countries with relatively few restrictions. So we talked about this on Friday a little bit. So we talked about things like countries putting barriers, and I think I used the example of chocolate to protect industries. That does not help economic growth. Barriers to free trade are these things like tariffs. So these taxes that are on the borders that stop people from sending things in. Quotas. So a quota would be like, for example, let's use my chocolate example. If industries need to meet a certain amount of chocolate to be put into the market, they will stop other countries from sending in chocolate. There's regulations, so certain countries will have, say, environmental restrictions and standards, and that can stop economic growth. So the example that we talked about last video was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So this is an example where the borders between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, they have a lot less taxes and tariffs, so that stuff can be going in more frequently. I forgot to mention last time I even had it opened, and I completely overlooked it. There is a new free trade agreement in North America. I think it's U.S. MCA. It came through with the Trump administration, so you can have a look at it. It's known also as this idea of the NAFTA 2.0, so it's just an improvement on the free trade agreement. Some say improvement, some say not. Again, you'll have to read into it and find out what you think, where your position lies. So, that is the idea of free trade and trade liberalization. I will remember that because that is a very crucial part of economic growth. So here's just two examples of trade before and trade after this idea of free trade. So before the 1970s, raw materials moved from developing countries to developed countries. And then the finished products would move from would move to the developing countries and between the developed. So when we talked about the triangle trade in class, where raw material were going back to Europe, then they were going to go to Africa, so they get the slaves back, that whole thing. Imagine that just minus the slaves. So raw material was going from the developing countries to developed countries. They would manufacture these things, and then they would ship them back to the developing countries so they can buy them. And they would also sell them between each other. Maybe I'll give you... no, I think that's good. Let's move on. If you have any questions about that, please feel free to ask in the comments or email me. So then trade after 1970, it increased movement of goods between developed countries. So these countries that have the industries, they are trading things a lot quicker. Increased movement of finished products from developing countries to developed. So we see countries that were at first having to buy things from the developed countries, they're starting to make their own industries. They're starting to make their own factories that can produce goods, and they're going to start to sell them to the developed countries. So places like China is an excellent example. So China at one time was buying lots of things. Then they developed their own industry. And if you're curious about that, I can give you a few links and a few resources, because the way that they developed it is known as the Great Leap Forward. In terms of economics, transformed China into what it is now. In terms of human life, we're talking millions of deaths based on the policies of China at that time. So China now exports things all over the world. A lot of things that we have right now were made in China. Our iPhones, anything. I'm looking around this room right now. I'm sure there's lots of things in this room that were made in China. So now that's the reason that they can sell things. They sell things more to developed countries is because they can sell them at a cheaper price, because they're not having to pay workers the higher wages. The higher the wages, the higher the price, because you need to have that profit space in between. So places like China who have lower wages, and India as well, they have lower wages, which means they can pay their they can sell their goods for a cheaper price to still make that profit. So another way of increasing economic growth is through foreign investment. But this has two very strong camps in it. So the positives and the negatives. So a positive for foreign investment: foreign investors infuse capital for development that may not otherwise have been available. So, for example, we have a country and foreign companies put money in to build a factory. So that country, a relatively poor country, didn't have the resources to make that industry. However, now they have it because this company has put money in. It provides jobs because now they need factory workers, people to come into this factory and make whatever the product is. And then it also increases a tax base because now you have people who have a job who you can now tax. So it brings in revenue for the country. On the flip side, so the people who see foreign investment as a negative, this is foreign control over important industries. So again, we're going to use country A as an example. If a foreign investor comes in and let's say they take over an important industry, let's say country A has oil and now there's oil companies from other countries there. That country's kind of lost control over that industry. And then that means that the profits that would have came from the sale of, say, this resource of oil are not staying in the country, but they're going to the country where, or the business or the corporation that now owns that sort of that industry. So those are that is a key thing to understand. So foreign investment as well is very important. It is a red word, so keep that in mind as well. Another word that you should be aware of is outsourcing. Again, red word. This refers to the movement of factories and production out of countries with high labor costs. So these usually be the more developed countries to countries with lower labor cost, generally the developing countries. So we'll use an example. We'll use this map from on slide 21. So let's say the United States. This is actually we won't use the map. We'll use an actual real life example. In the United States, they make cars in Detroit. They would make Ford, all these sort of American cars. The factories had to pay workers a certain amount because in the United States they have wage laws and they have benefits and all these sort of things that kind of raise the price of production for the owners of these car companies. So what they would do is they would take their companies, their factories, and they would move them to Mexico. So you would move, say, a Ford factory from Detroit and they moved it to Mexico because in Mexico they don't have to pay the workers as much as American workers. They don't have to worry about a lot of things like, say, medical and health insurance, all that sort of stuff. So they are making more money off these cars because the price of the car is still at the same price, but now wages are going down, health insurance are going down, restrictions are going down, taxes are going down. So now this space in between, basically this has in my head, in between my hands, that is the profit that was being made. That had a huge impact on, say, places like Detroit. If I can find, there's really good documentaries on Netflix about the economic situation in Detroit, Michigan, because of the outsourcing of these sort of businesses. So on slide 23 and 24, you'll answer questions 9 to 16. It's 1-800-INDIA. So outsourcing to India is one of the it has been seen as a route that a lot of countries have taken. So call centers, you'll say you have a product that's not working, you call the helpline. A lot of times that the call center is not in the country that you're even in. You want to do this as an experiment. Find a product in your house, call and ask where they are. So for example, personal example, I called Shaw because I use Shaw for internet. I asked the person on the phone, who was very nice. I asked, where are you from? They were in Eastern Canada. So it wasn't totally crazy. But another example is I was setting up my modem, my router, whatever. The thing that gives internet. And I called because I wanted to know how to help set this up. And I asked the lady where she was from. Just curious, right? She's from the Philippines. So you can see companies, they will outsource these sort of things like call centers because they can pay the people a lower wage but still have the same service. So outsourcing and foreign investment, these sort of things are linked to this idea of sweatshops. So associated with large transnational companies that employ low-skilled workers who are paid below average wages. Sweatshop workers receive few or no benefits and sometimes physically or sexually harassed on the job. Workers are frequently women or children who have fewer alternatives. Often the goods produced by sweatshops are sold in developing countries. So we talked about this the first day of class. We talked about Apple factories in China. They pay their workers a certain wage. We talked about Nike in Vietnam. So these sort of industries, they use these places and they exploit the situation. So if we go back and we talk about privatization and we talk about the foreign investment, there are some positives to having these new factories, jobs and a tax base, but there is also the negative, and the negative is the physical sexual harassment and the no benefits and the low pay. It could be argued that it's equivalent to economic slavery, like I brought up last. I think I brought up last video, and I brought up the first day of class as well, because these people do not have they don't have any alternatives. They must do these jobs to provide for their families, because in these countries, we're talking about countries that don't have the economic net that can catch people who are struggling. There's very few social programs that can provide aid and assistance to people, especially in developing countries that are still getting over things like colonialism and imperialism. They are still trying to get over these hurdles, and now they're being introduced to, a sense, another form of economic imperialism. These transnational corporations come in and they set the rules, and if the countries don't play by these rules, then they just pick up and they leave, which has a negative impact on the developing country's economy. And then we, as living in a developed country, we kind of live off and we buy the products of these people. And I mean, there are few alternatives, especially for us, because a lot of clothing stores, a lot of goods that we buy on a daily basis are produced by these sort of situations. So sweatshops is really important. There is a 21-minute video of a Nike sweatshop behind the swoosh on slide 26. I would encourage you to watch it, not only just for the sake of our class, but also just for the sake of being human beings in the world and looking at the conditions that others are living in. The lovely thing about social studies is that it is a class that you take outside of school, and it's designed to help build you as a conscious member of society. Because once you leave school, you are going to always be dealing with people, and to know the history behind certain people and actions and institutions, it's important. Again, so on slide 27, the clothes on our back, 3 minutes. I would encourage you to watch. And then on the last slide, slide 28, you'll answer questions 17 and 18 based on this this cartoon, this political cartoon. So that is it for today. I would encourage you, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to comment them or to email them. So keep in mind, tomorrow there won't be a video. Wednesday will be the next video, and that'll be the last video for the week. And then Thursday, no video, and Friday is spring break. So keep doing what you're doing. I know we're moving into the next unit, and you may still be working on stuff from the old unit. That's totally fine. The project, the mapping project, the quiz, the booklet. Please keep working on these things. And if you working on stuff from the first unit, send them anyways too. Just do as much as you can. If you feel that you're way behind, that's fine. Because here's the thing, you watch these videos on your own time. If it means, over spring break you watch one or you do some work, then just do it. It's totally fine. I don't think you're going to be traveling somewhere right now. And going outside, it looks nice now. This morning it looked absolutely dreadful. So yeah, don't worry if you feel that you're behind. Please email and reach out to me if you feel stressed or anything. I'll do my best to uh, alleviate your stress. Okay, I will see you Wednesday. Keep up the good work. Stay safe, and see you Wednesday.